with that said, I want to start off by setting the context for that discussion with this discussion of Reconstruction. And the handout that you should have now, that kind of made its way around, is the same as what's here on the board. We want to deal with this period of Reconstruction that comes after the Civil War. So last time we kind of set the stage in terms of the road to the Civil War. Right? With this, we want to think through the destruction of the Civil War, and then how is it that Americans are going to be able to put the pieces of the puzzle back together again. Right? We go from having one nation to having two nations. Right? Two nations that are at war with each other for a 4-year period. It's still the bloodiest war in American history, right? Bloodier than all other wars combined. So then how are you going to put the pieces of the puzzle back together again? How does that work? How do we become modern? How do we become one nation again? Well, we can't understand that or answer that without looking at the Reconstruction period. And so that's what we'll do using this handout, which is why I told you that I was going to give you a detailed handout and you can make that chapter on Reconstruction optional, because I'm going to give you all that I need you to know about this, and you can take this with you. Let's begin with the title. All right, we'll begin with the title of Reconstruction. In some ways, I think the title is the perfect title because that's exactly what has to happen. Reconstructing the nation, right? Reconstructing the nation. Literally, you're going to have to rebuild the United States, especially the southern states, after the war, right? This is a war fought on U.S. soil, not fought abroad. And so, specifically, you're going to have to find ways to rebuild and reconstruct the nation in a way that makes sense, and in a way that's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult on several levels. So think about this topic or this title of Reconstruction and what that means. And I really want you to think about Reconstruction in at least two forms. There's going to be this literal Reconstruction. Right? As you see in the outline, it's talking about literally rebuilding buildings and replanting crops that have been destroyed and burned out, and animals that have been killed have to be replaced. People are starving. How do you deal with that? Water supplies are poisoned. Right? This is a real war. And so folks are going to have to try to find a way to rebuild and reconstruct their society. But also, in addition to literal reconstruction, you're going to have a kind of metaphorical reconstruction. Right? You have to psychologically put the pieces of the puzzle back together again. North and South have become two different nations. They have been killing each other for 4 years. How are they now going to say, you know what, no hard feelings? Are they going to be able to do that? This is the kind of psychological part that I want to have us try to work through. I want to try to put ourselves in the positions of people living through this time period and think about what they would have been afraid of, think about what they would have been hopeful for, and how they would have experienced this period of Reconstruction. So we're going to try to do that a bit today. So think about the title itself. In addition to the title, you'll notice I put a couple of dates up top. I'm not a big date person, but I put a couple of dates up here, and they're dates that don't necessarily correspond with the dates in the textbook or in some other sources. So why did I put these particular dates? I'm going to come back to that in a second, because as we know, that the Reconstruction period comes at the end of the Civil War, right? Civil War goes from 1861 to 1865. Well, then why do I have Reconstruction beginning in 1863, 2 years before the war is over? Well, I'm going to argue that there are things happening that are going to foreshadow how the nation is going to have to put itself together again, right? How it's going to struggle to put itself together again. And that process begins even before the war is over. Right? That process begins even before the war is over. So, for example, January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Right? Anybody heard of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation before? What is that? What is that about? Some kind of proclamation, right? Some kind of declaration. What is he doing?
It's the official statement that all slaves are no longer slaves. That any slaves that are left in America, they're free now.
Sort of. Theoretically, you're exactly right. But in practice, there's going to be some challenges to that, and that's part of the significance, I think, of the proclamation itself. You're right. Lincoln puts forth this Emancipation Proclamation that is supposed to free the slaves. It's supposed to free the slaves. So that's why I'm saying that this really should be considered a part of the Reconstruction period, because imagine how much of a tipping point that is. There are 4 million slaves. Suddenly, if they're all free, this is going to be a very different looking society all of a sudden. But the other part that I was kind of pushing you on a bit is Lincoln doesn't free all the slaves. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declares that in the states in rebellion, in the states currently in rebellion, the slaves will be freed. But we can argue that there's a sovereignty problem here. Lincoln is freeing slaves technically in another nation. He's not president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis is. The Confederacy has left 2 years ago. They're currently at war with them. So technically, he doesn't have the power to free the slaves in the Confederacy. Now, Lincoln does have the power to free some slaves. There were some border states that had not left the Union, that were still a part of the Union. And some of those border states have slaves. So Lincoln could have freed a certain number of slaves by saying, look, the slaves that are still in my country, essentially, are now free. He does not do so. Why not? Why do you think he doesn't free the slaves in the border states, but attempts to free the ones in the Confederacy?
To
Preserve the Union. He knows if he does that, those border states, we're out of here. All right, we're going to join those. He does not want to lose any more states. So many see this as political. They see it as a war measure. In addition, Lincoln also knows what he was doing in terms of freeing the slaves in the Confederacy, because he knows that when the slaves hear of this, they're going to take their own freedom. The idea is they're going to run away. They had already been running away by the thousands. Right? That they're going to say, we're no longer slaves. Let's get out of here. Right? Which will undermine the Confederate war effort. Who's doing the work? Slaves. So if you can undermine the Confederate war effort, you can win the war, perhaps more quickly. And this is actually really important because the Confederacy is doing well early on in the war. Right? It's not a foregone conclusion that the Union is going to win early on. So this is an important war measure, but in terms of its real power, it's questionable. But Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, I would say, is a part of the Reconstruction period. It's setting up how the nation is going to have to struggle to reconstruct itself. So that's why I put 1863 as the opening date and not 1865. Look at the summary. The summary is kind of what I said earlier about how I want you to think about the psychological aspects of this. I want you to try to put yourselves in the shoes of people living through the time and look at this period through their eyes. This is not easy. I know that it's not easy to do that, but we'll try to do that a few different ways over the next few minutes, right, to try to look at this period through their eyes. So the period of Reconstruction is extremely significant in terms of the political, economic, and social transformation of the U.S. Although momentous changes were occurring in these and other areas in these years, it may be most useful to consider the psychological trauma that Americans of various colors, classes, genders, you could argue as well, regions, experienced as they sought to reconstruct their lives, as well as their particular responses to such trauma, right? As well as their particular responses to such trauma. So we want to see what is it that they are responding to, and how do they respond? How do they react? For better or for worse, there are going to be some responses, there are going to be some reactions. So that's what we want to kind of work our way through. Now what I want to do is kind of show you what I was thinking in constructing this outline so that it makes some sense. It makes sense to me, but I want to make sure it makes sense to you. We talked about letter A already, right? I wanted you to think about Reconstruction in kind of two forms. Literally rebuilding the nation, but also the kind of psychological rebuilding. How do you put this imagined community back together again? How is that going to happen, and how difficult is it going to be to do so? And for the freedmen, right? Suddenly you have 4 million folks that were slaves one day and are free the next. How are they going to imagine community? How are they going to define freedom for themselves? Because you can argue no one can give you freedom. You have to take it. You have to define it for yourself. Otherwise, it's not freedom. So what you're going to see is that individuals are going to define freedom in different ways. One person may define it this way. Another person may define it that way. So we'll look at a couple of examples of these freedmen and how they will define freedom for themselves. So for letter B, some say the Civil War is about economics, that it really was a victory of a northern industrial economy, right, a more modern economy, over a more, quote-unquote, backward southern agricultural economy. Many will argue that that's why the North wins the war eventually. Their economy is much larger, they have larger population, much more railroad track than the South, and they're able to outlast the South, right? So So this idea of being modern is going to be something very real, even though the South is incredibly wealthy, but they don't have some of the advantages. So some say this is all about economics, and we'll see how that translates moving forward. What about the politics of Reconstruction? Most chapters in a textbook talk about all of the various politics, the laws that are passed, the debates that happen in Congress, and the conflict between Congress and the president, right? The politics of Reconstruction are really important. But I want you really to think of this in terms of the big picture, right? The kind of big picture here. We're going to work our way around this in a way that makes sense in terms of the big picture, these political transformations. And so I want you to think of the politics in two main forms. There's presidential Reconstruction and there's congressional Reconstruction, right? Presidential and congressional. You can kind of tell who's in charge, who's running the show based on the title, right? Under presidential Reconstruction, who's in charge? The president, right? The president's leading the way. What about congressional? Well, eventually, a couple of years in, Congress will take control of Reconstruction. The president and Congress are fighting each other. I know this sounds like a foreign concept, but the president and Congress don't always get along. And so they're going to be battling each other over who's going to be in charge of this process. So basically what I want you to remember about presidential Reconstruction is the president wants to get back to business as usual. The president wants to forgive and forget, sort of let bygones be bygones. That was a horrible time. Let's move forward. Right? Forgive and forget. Reconciliation. First under Abraham Lincoln, but of course Abe Lincoln doesn't last too long into Reconstruction. I think it's 5 days, right? He's assassinated. So his successor, Andrew Johnson, will take over. Generally, he'll follow many of the same policies in terms of forgive and forget. Right? I generally think of it that way. There are differences between the two. So the president is all about reconciliation. Now, Congress, especially the radical Republicans in Congress, are not going to be about forgive and forget. They're going to be about no, the Confederacy needs to be punished. Many of the radical Republicans are like, you know what? Confederate leaders should be hung. They committed treason. What's the penalty for treason? Death. So many of them are like, no, you can't just slap them on the wrist and say, okay, let's all come back to the national family table. They need to be, their lands taken from them, charged, prosecuted, executed, perhaps. So Congress is going to look a little different in their vision of Reconstruction. So that's what some of these details lay out, right? Main goal of presidential Reconstruction, reconciliation of North and South. Now, as we mentioned, Lincoln does initially hope that blacks will emigrate or leave the country. He's not sure that this can be a multiracial nation. He thinks that may be the best solution. He's a member of the American Colonization Society. But he is in favor of assisting the freedmen in certain ways. He's going to do some things that will aid the freedmen. He says that educated blacks should vote, for instance. He's going to allow the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is a government organization, a government bureau, a government department, essentially, that's supposed to help the freedmen adjust to freedom. What does it do? It does at least two main things, this Freedmen's Bureau, to try to help the freedmen adjust to freedom. Number one, it's going to help them negotiate labor contracts with their former owners, who now might be their employers. So say your only skill, because you've been doing it all your life, your only skill is picking cotton. Right? The majority of the freedmen were field hands involved in picking cotton. So their skill is picking cotton. In addition, we still need somebody to do this work in the South, right? Who's going to do the work? Well, the folks that had always done that work. And so you want to get paid to do the work now, though, right? That's freedom. You're not going to do it for free. So how do you negotiate that? Hey, I know you used to be my slave owner, but now our relationship has to change, right? I need a check. Now, part of the problem is, okay, here, sign this contract. Well, I can't even read that contract. It was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. So 95% of African Americans in 1865 can't read. So the Freedmen's Bureau would help them read contracts, work through them, sign them, work out deals, quite often with their former masters. Quite often, they didn't even leave the plantation they had lived on. Right? They're like, look, I'll just stay here and work for you if you pay me. If you treat me fairly, we're good. Some will leave, as we'll discuss. discuss, but some choose not to. So the Freedmen's Bureau can help them negotiate labor contracts. In addition, the second big thing the Freedmen's Bureau helped to do was education. Education. Some of the freedmen will define freedom as their ability to read and write. Their ability to read and write. Remember, it had been illegal to teach slaves to read and write. So many of them are like, how do I know I'm not a slave anymore? Well, I'm going to learn how to read. I'm going to go to school. There are stories about 1865, the year the war ends, and suddenly you have a classroom like the size of this, let's say, and you have like 5 generations of one family learning how to read together. You got a little 5-year-old kid that was a slave learning how to read. You have that child's parents, 25 years old, learning how to read. You have that parent's parent, so the child's grandparent at age 50, let's say, learning how to read so they can read the Bible. A great-grandparent perhaps learning how to read. Why? Because freedom for them might be equated with literacy, the ability to read. So what do you see explode in this period, especially since African Americans aren't allowed to attend most schools? Start your own school. This is the origin of most historically black colleges and universities. Start your own school to learn how to read and to be an educated citizen, essentially. Be able to live your life. I taught at a school for a year in Maryland called Bowie State University. Bowie State University, great school. It was founded in 1865. It's still a historically black college to this day. It was founded in 1865. The very year the Civil War ends, folks are like, okay, we got to build a school. So think about this kind of equating education with freedom, right? Education. So those are 2 important things that the Freedmen's Bureau would do, which is, an important idea. And the fact that government was seen as supposing to help the freedmen catch up, right? Not just say, okay, you're free, have a good life, but okay, look, we know it's been kind of messed up, kind of 200 plus years of horrible behavior. We feel like we owe you a little something, right? So think about that idea as well moving forward, and whether it will hold. But again, congressional Reconstruction will go a little bit of a different direction than presidential. Those radical Republicans in Congress will feel like they need to punish the South before they readmit them to the Union. So, for example, under this Congressional Reconstruction Act of 1867, the South is divided into 5 military districts. It's divided up, each with a Union general in charge to make sure that they follow the policies of Reconstruction. The South is essentially occupied and forced to follow Reconstruction. All Southern states forced to drop new state constitutions and ratify the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about in a second. The Republicans were a northern party. They had very little presence in the South. As we said last time, Lincoln doesn't even campaign in the South. He doesn't even appear on the ballot in most southern states. So the Republicans are a northern party, but some of them are thinking, this might be an opportunity to move into the South, to weaken the Democratic Party, and to take hold there, if they can give the right to vote to these 4 million former slaves. Now, African Americans will vote Republican overwhelmingly in this period. More than 80-90% will vote Republican. That's not going to change until the Great Depression, until Franklin Roosevelt, and they switch, of course, and now 90% vote Democratic. But back in the day, the Democratic Party was seen as the party of white supremacy. Right? They were clear in their campaign brochures that they were the party, quote unquote, of the white man and of the South. So the politics were very regional and very racial at the time. Why would African Americans vote Republican, do you think? Why do they vote Republican for the first 70 years?
Because that's the political party is like people who are like fighting against it.
Exactly. Even though we talked about the difficulties with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, it's still seen as the party of the freedmen, right? Folks that are trying at least to do something for them and to help them out. So, yeah, they're going to feel a certain loyalty to the Republican Party for a long time. And some Republicans are, in favor of racial equality, and many more are like, man, this is a good opportunity to beat the other party. As we know, politics is politics. So we're going to see that as well. 3 Civil War amendments will be passed. 3 Civil War amendments, as they're referred to, are passed in this period. The 13th Amendment is passed in 1865. 13th Amendment is passed in 1865. What does the 13th Amendment do? End the slave, for end slavery, right? End slavery. It says essentially you can't be enslaved as a result of your race, previous condition of servitude, except as punishment for a crime. There's an important loophole in the 13th Amendment. It says you can't be enslaved except as punishment for a crime. We're going to see how that loophole is going to be significant in this period, and some say to this day, in terms of helping perhaps to create a mass incarceration issue, prison industrial complex, all of that, right? This notion that, okay, maybe you can have your rights taken from you if you're convicted of a crime. We'll sort of see how that plays out. But it's an important step, right? Important legal step to say that you cannot or should not have slavery. The 13th Amendment. 14th Amendment was passed in 1868. It's really more about like the rights of citizenship and due process. It says you can't have those rights abridged, around issues of race. 1868. 1870, the 15th Amendment will be passed. The 15th Amendment. What does the 15th Amendment do? Anybody know? Has to do with suffrage or the right of the franchise. We talked about that before. What do those words refer to? Voting. Voting rights. So yes, it says you cannot have the right of franchise abridged because of your race or previous condition of servitude. Now there's an important loophole in that one too. Because even though it mentions you shouldn't have your voting rights abridged because of your race, it does not say anything about gender. It does not say anything about gender. So technically, black men will get the right to vote about 50 years before women do. Because the 19th Amendment isn't passed until 1920. So think about these issues, how this period of Reconstruction does begin a process of expanding the democracy. But it only begins the process. It is not going to solve everything. It is not going to solve everything. And some will argue that it's actually a failure. I want you to keep that question in mind. Is Reconstruction a failure or not? We'll talk through that and think about that. Bless you. In fact, it's going to start some things and leave certain things undone. So, for example, in the 1960s, when people are marching and things for the right to vote, we often call the Civil Rights era the second Reconstruction. We connect what happens in the 1860s and 70s to what happens in the 1960s. So again, think about this connection between past and present. Some will argue that we need a whole nother movement to finish what was started but not completed early on. But those are the Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th amendments. The next one just has to do with migration, the mobility of people, the movement of people. There's a lot of movement in the country after the Civil War, in part because things like immigration are usually cut off in time of war, right? It's hard for immigrants to come in when folks are shooting at each other. Right, so once that ends, you get immigration picking up again and people moving. But you also have the tremendous movement of the freedmen. Right? You have tremendous movement of the freedmen. For some, this question of mobility is a part of the definition of freedom itself. Imagine if I was a slave. Now, I hate imagining this, but imagine if I was a slave, right, and suddenly I'm told I'm free. I'm first going to be like, yeah, right. I'm going to look at, oh, you're trying to get me so you can beat me. I'm suspicious, right? But then I'm like, maybe I really am free, right? The day I'm told I'm free, I'm going to want to define that. I'm going to want to test it. How might I test it? Oh, I'm free? Are you sure that I'm really... I take off. Slaves are not allowed to leave their plantation without a written pass. Many slaves had never left their plantation. So how might they test to see if they're really free? Roll out. Some want to leave because slavery is horrible. This is what they identified with, slavery. Where are you going? Anywhere else but here. Right? You have some people that start walking. Where are you going to go? I'm heading north. Why? That's where freedom is. Right? This idea of the north as a land of freedom. So some will leave and think about mobility as freedom, just the ability to leave, even if it means you have to walk. Right? Some identify freedom with family. Remember, under slavery, your family members could be sold away. So some, when they're told that they're free, decide they're going to leave to go find family members. I'll give you a quick story. There's a story about a husband and wife, right? The husband and wife have been sold apart from each other. And so the husband is like, man, I never stopped loving this lady. And it's been 10 years since I've seen her. But now that I'm free, I'm going to find my wife. Put my family back together again. They're like, there's no way you're going to find her. Right? There's no internet back then. You can't just type in, find out her Facebook page. How are you going to find her? I'm going to find my wife. So he starts doing research. Let's say he gets a newspaper and he heard that she's in a certain part of Georgia, and so he's looking at the news from that particular county where he thinks she might be, and he gets that idea about a city she might live in. So he goes to that city and he's talking to people in the city. Maybe he goes down to the local store and he's like, man, you know a lady, she's like 4'11", she's a little short, did a birthmark right here, this and that. People are like, nah, I don't know what you're talking about. And he just keeps asking people, I need to find this lady, she used to be my wife. And he said, birthmark, I know a lady that fits that description. He's like, what, really? Yeah, she moved about 20 miles down the river. Okay, which direction? Okay, goes down to where he heard she lives, right? He's asking people, do you know this lady? Do you know this lady? And they're like, yeah, go check over there. That might be Martha. That might be Martha. So he goes over the river and he's coming up to this farm and he sees her coming out of a cabin. Oh my goodness. She looks just like Beyonce. I remember back in the day. Oh my goodness. He sees her. He's like, I still love this lady. I need to go get her. So he's getting ready to go approach her and tell her who he is, and he sees her new husband come out of the house. That's exactly, I think he probably said a couple curse words at that point. Now, she thought he was dead. He thought she was dead. This is over a decade before. He's not mad at her. He just knows that, hey, what do I do? Do I ruin her life or her new happiness? She looks happy. Do I just walk away? These are some of the decisions that folks would have to make, right? But for many, that theme of family and the theme of mobility would come together to help them define freedom and what it meant. Right? How do I know I'm free? I can go try to reconnect family. I can try to go to find children that have been sold away, husbands and wives that have been sold apart. Some are successful at finding them. Most are not. Most are not. But think about what this means symbolically and how people are trying to reconstruct their lives, how they're trying to define freedom for themselves. Now, part of this is going to be political empowerment. What happens with all these new voters? Right? All these new voters. Well, what you're going to get is a backlash, right? A backlash against this power. Suddenly, if you have 4 million folks that were slaves one day and now we're free, maybe you have 4 million prospective new voters that might be loyal to the Republican Party. This is going to lead to a politics of fear in the post-slave era, and part of why you're going to see some of the violence that we're seeing develop here. There's going to be a backlash against this. Imagine a state like South Carolina, for instance, where this might really come to a head. Why? Because South Carolina is kind of an extreme case. Remember, South Carolina was a colony of a colony. Remember, those folks from Barbados pick up their slave society in Barbados and essentially move to South Carolina. So the racial numbers were always highly skewed in South Carolina. There are certain parts where it might be 65% African American. So what happens now if you live in an area that's 65% African American and folks have the right to vote? What if they decide to vote in Barack Obama in Charleston, South Carolina? 1865. Is that possible? Yeah. Doesn't seem like it, but it's going to be very possible. And so there's a fear that develops. Imagine if you're a former slaveholder, right? Now slavery's over. You're a little nervous. What if those folks hold a grudge? Hey, that whipping last week, my bad. Right? That might not be good enough. There are a lot of folks that are like, man, what if these folks cut our throats? Those 75% of white Southerners that don't own slaves, man, now I got to compete with these 4 million workers in the same way you all talked about last time. This is fearful. This is threatening to many. Now, we might think that 75%, which has so much in common with these other workers, right? They're at the lowest rung of the economic society. They're all struggling for cotton-picking jobs and such, that they might form an imagined community, make the system work for them. But as we know, issues of race often come in to divide people that might have everything else in common, kind of like we saw with the indentured servants, right? They're going to be separated, using race essentially to keep them separate. And so we'll see that develop as well. So think about this politics of fear. So at a place like South Carolina, you're going to see some momentous changes. You're going to see some tipping points. For example, in 1870, in the South Carolina legislature, there will be 87 African Americans and only 40 whites. Imagine that, only 5 years after the end of slavery. 87 African Americans in the House and only 40 whites. They outnumber them 2-1. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you a fictional one. I hate to do this to you, but it's okay. Y'all forgive me. I'm going to make you slaveholders for a second, just for like 30 seconds. Just for like 30 seconds. Not for real, just hypothetically, like, okay, 30 seconds. So this is the case. Let's say you're a Charleston, South Carolina slaveholder, right? You've been doing well before the war. Let's say you had 200 slaves. This makes you easily a millionaire. Suddenly, your slave population is gone. You're broke. You may have all this land, but who's going to plant the crops? Who's going to work it? So you're in the house. You've got the shades drawn. The electricity's probably turned off. You're probably drinking some dark liquor. You're sad. What am I going to do? There's a knock at the door. You're like, go away. I'm sad. They knock again. Hey, boss, I need to talk to you. That voice sounds familiar. Who's that? So you go and open the door. You look outside and you see, say, Connie Brown standing there. I'm standing there. I'm looking sharp. I got a haircut, some nice clothes. I know you can't imagine that, but some nice clothes on. I look at you like, oh. And so you're in the doorway. You're like, say, Connie, is that you? I was like, hey, boss, how you doing? You're my former slave. Wow, you look good. I lost a little weight. You've been laying off the donuts. I was like, yeah, you look fantastic. I'm like, thanks, boss. Yeah, I've been working out, going to the gym, but I also I went to Mount Sac and I'm taking some history classes. That got me interested in politics, and so I decided to run for office. So guess what, boss? I'm your new lieutenant governor. I'm your new congressman. I'm in the House of Representatives. What's just happened to you? Your head has exploded in the doorway, right? You're standing in the doorway like, oh my goodness. Last Tuesday, you were my slave, and now you're my congressman? That's crazy. Imagine psychologically how, even the most well-adjusted a person is like, wait, what? And of course, me, I'm a smart aleck. So I'm outside like, yeah, boss, I'm your congressman now. I think your taxes might go up. Oh, no, this has to be fearful. This has to cause some anxiety. Right? Because you don't know what the future holds. You don't know what the future holds. So what we're going to see is how folks are going to manage and handle that anxiety, and it's not going to be well. It's going to lead to this idea that the freedmen need to be controlled. They need to be, quote unquote, put back in their place. What's their place? Slavery, or a position similar to slavery, because you need their labor, but you don't want them voting. Right? You need their labor still. Who's going to produce this cotton that makes the region wealthy, that makes the nation wealthy? But you don't want them kind of challenging their position and their status. So a lot of what we're going to see in this remaining discussion is how people are going to try to put them back into a position mirroring slavery. Well, how are you going to do that? They got 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. They have certain, I erased it, they have certain de jure rights, right? De jure rights. De jure is a Latin phrase that means in law. 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment is a de jure right. So let's say the 15th Amendment. That is an official right that says you have the right to vote. Now, de facto is going to be a little different than de jure. De facto means in fact, or in reality, or in practice. So what does this mean? Well, you have the de facto 15th Amendment that says you have the right to vote. But there might be ways to make it difficult to actually exercise that right. There might be certain de facto practices that can be put in place that even though you technically have the right, it might be difficult to vote. We're going to see some examples of that in a second. De jure and de facto rights, de jure and de facto racism. So official and unofficial sort of forms here. For example, you're going to see an increasingly hostile environment leading to the passage of what are called black codes. What's a black code? A black code is basically a law that only applies to a certain racial group. We've seen this before. We saw it with the way that the laws around indentured servitude, right, were constructed. There were slave codes on the books that said, for example, you can't teach a slave to read and write. That was a slave code. Well, now slavery is over. So what's going to happen? You're going to see a modification of those rules. They're no longer slave codes, but now they're black codes. They only apply to the freedmen, kind of like we saw earlier in the colonial period. So, for example, what might be some examples of these? Well, there are vagrancy laws passed. Vagrancy laws. What's a vagrant? What's vagrancy? If you go across the street to 7-Eleven, you might see a sign on the door when you go in that says no loitering or no vagrancy. Right? We still use that terminology. At this point, what vagrancy really meant was you had to be employed and prove you had a job at all times. Right? You had to be employed and prove you had a job. Well, what happens if they come up to say Connie and say, hey, where you working? I'm like, you know what? I'm in between jobs. I just left this cotton employment, but I'm thinking I might get a job at Google. I got an application in there. You're under arrest. But for what? You're a vagrant. You can't prove you have employment. But I got an application in. Sorry, you're under arrest. So I'm taken to jail. This is a horrible story. I don't know why I keep using myself as an example. But I'm taken to jail for vagrancy. I'm put in jail. It's a crime. It's a crime. Well, wait a second. What's going to happen with me then? Remember the 13th Amendment says you can't be enslaved except as punishment for a crime. Suddenly, they give me a striped uniform, put me on a chain gang, and I'm digging ditches. Southern roads. Or, what often happened is, my former slave owner, who now needs labor, comes down to the local jail. Hey, I need about 20 workers. Look, I'll give you $100 to the sheriff. Yeah, I got 20 boys for you. I may end up working for the same person I used to work for as a slave. But what happened to all my rights? De jure and de facto ways of taking them away. So you're going to see these mechanisms put in place. Property laws against property ownership. So laws that say that the freedman can't own property. Now that's going to be doubly significant in an agricultural society because if you're a farmer with no land, what are you? You got to work for somebody else. Right? You got to work for somebody else. This is where we get the development of things like sharecropping. Right? Sharecropping seemed like theoretically a great idea. Sharecropping might work something like this. Imagine my former boss again. Right? He's got all this land, he's got tools, he's got cotton seed, but he doesn't have any workers. Now me, I have the skills to plant and harvest a crop, but I don't have land, I don't have tools, I don't have seed. So we can help each other out in theory, right? We can enter into a sharecropping arrangement. Right? We can enter into a sharecropping arrangement. Okay, boss, look, tell you what. Me and my family will stay here on the plantation and we'll work. We'll plant this cotton this year. I know you can't pay us, so we're going to live here in the cabin, right? We're going to use the seeds and tools, we're going to plant it, and then when we're done, since we're doing all the work, but it's your land, we're going to share the crop. Split it 50-50, right? Sounds like a good deal for everybody, right? Everybody can make some money. Well, what happens? You plant, so say 9 months comes, harvest comes, we go sell the cotton crop, let's say $1,000. So I'm like, whew, it's a great year, boss. $1,000, let me get my $500 and I'll be out of your hair, right? Boss is like, I'm not paying you anything. What do you mean? We had a deal. I'm not paying you anything. Well, I'm going to sue you. We had a deal. I'm going to sue you. I'm free. Well, some of these black codes said it was illegal for blacks to testify in court against whites. So how am I going to testify against them? How am I going to even defend my economic rights? De facto examples of black codes. So you see the way they're functioning essentially to put people back into a position similar to slavery. They're not trying to kill everybody. They needed their labor, but they are trying to make them act like they're still slaves. That's essentially the goal. Intimidation also will be used, right? Violence and intimidation. Again, that's part of what you're seeing, I think, with some of the violence in these texts, right? How do you make people act like they're still slaves? Threaten them. Right? Intimidation. Organizations like the Klan are formed. The KKK is formed in 1867 in Tennessee. And former Confederate generals and others will form the Klan, right, and essentially harass people, threaten them, terrorize them. It's a terror organization to try to make them behave in the way they wanted them to try to make them not vote. Now, what's interesting is that initial Klan is formed, and they targeted not just African Americans, but they also harassed and terrorized and beat and killed white Republicans. White Republicans that had gone south and helped educate African Americans, helped them register to vote, right, helped them organize these labor contracts, might find themselves the target of the Klan. This wasn't just about race, this is about power. I'm trying to get that power back. So we're going to see some important examples of all of these things here. So imagine this example. We talked about South Carolina, right, how They're going to actually have 87 African Americans in the House of Representatives. Well, in South Carolina, many of these officials in government will be intimidated out of office. So let's say I'm in my new office as Lieutenant Governor, and I'm unpacking and there's a knock at the front door. Hey, what are you doing? I just got here. How you doing? I'm just in office. They're like, yeah, there are about 15 hooded men outside in robes with torches and shotguns. Like, oh, that's not a good thing. Well, the men say you might want to get out of town. If you're still here in 15 days, your office might accidentally burn down with you in it. Ooh, that doesn't sound good. What am I going to do? I'm going to start putting stuff back in the box, right? It's time to go. So intimidation will work. Well, wait a second. I thought I had all these political rights. That's true. But what rights do you have if you're dead? So think about de jure and de facto and how they're going to work together to begin to disenfranchise people, right? How they're going to help really sort of take away certain rights that are possible in this period. This is why you have folks voting in the 1860s, but then in the 1960s, you're going to need a Martin Luther King and a whole movement to try to get the right to vote 100 years later. Right? You're like, wait a second, I think I got it in 1870. Why do you need Martin Luther King in 1960? Well, because those rights are going to be slowly removed, or not so slowly removed in Reconstruction. So this is a disenfranchisement, by taking away the right to vote. Various methods might be used, again, de jure and de facto forms. Grandfather clauses were a specific way of taking away the right to vote that kind of worked like this. We still use that term, like grandfather, when something's grandfathered in, right? What grandfather clauses referred to in 1870 was basically this. If your grandfather had the right to vote, then you have the right to vote. But if your grandfather did not have the right to vote, let's say in 1865 or 1850, you don't have the right to vote. Now, who is that going to disenfranchise, do you think? All the freedmen, right? If they had just gotten the right to vote after the Civil War, then their grandfather almost certainly didn't have the right to vote. Right? So this is kind of a de facto way of taking away a de jure right in the 15th Amendment. Now, what's interesting is who else is this going to disenfranchise? Many poor whites. Remember how we talked about property qualifications and things as being a thing? Many poor whites, their grandfather didn't have the right to vote, so they're losing the right to vote too. Once again, we would think that this would lead to a class revolution, right? These non-slaveholders would get with freedmen and overlook their racial differences, focus on their class differences, focus on the fact that both of them are politically disempowered, and take over the region. That's not going to happen. Imagined community would seem to be possible. But remember, we looked at that notion of American exceptionalism before. Why is it we haven't had multiple kind of class revolutions? There are various answers to that question, and maybe you have your own. Literacy tests. What's a literacy test? It basically said, yeah, you can vote. You have the right to vote. And so I'd show up, let's say, in 1870 to vote. I'm so excited. Man, it's the first time. Can't wait to vote. Whew. I'm going to vote for first time. I'm so excited. They're like, yeah, here's your ballot. Oh, but before you take it, I need you to pass a literacy test. Wait, what? I'm learning to read right now, but I don't read very well. Sorry, sir. Okay, let me try. Okay. Here's your literacy test. I need you to, it's the way many of them worked. I need you to interpret this obscure portion of the Constitution and give me a specific analysis. Like, wait, whoa. I'm not a lawyer, right? I need to. Sir, do you want to vote or not? Yeah, I mean, I do, but there's a famous story from the 1960s about this, because they're still being used in the 50s and 1950s and 60s, right? So there's this famous story during the Civil Rights era where people are being disenfranchised. I think it's Mississippi, right? Mississippi is going to be very strong in this. They remove hundreds of thousands of people from the voting rolls and have to try to re-enroll them, right, during the 1960s. So they're trying to find somebody to register to vote in Mississippi, right? And people keep failing these literacy tests because who says whether you pass or fail? The clerk. I'm sorry you didn't pass. No, I did. I couldn't. No, sir, you didn't pass. Try again next year, right? So they're like, man, we need somebody that can pass this test, right? We need somebody that can pass this test. Well, they come across an African-American veteran, a World War II veteran, right? And he's like, I'm not scared. I'll go in there and register. They're like, you sure it's, Klan might be there? He's like, man, I shot people in Europe. let's go, right? So veterans don't play. They got that look, right? He's like, let's go. And they're like, okay, sir, if you're willing to do it, we're willing to take it. So they take him down to the office, and they're like, we have a gentleman here that wants to register to vote. He's like, okay. They bring him, you got to pass the literacy test. He's like, oh, no problem. They bring him this test, and, sir, we need you to interpret this portion of the Constitution to the best of your abilities. And he's kind of looking at him like, are you serious? They're like, sir, you got to do it. He's like, are you serious right now? I fought for this country. Sir, you got to pass this literacy test. It's an obscure portion of the Constitution. Do you want to do it or not? He's getting ready to leave, and he's like, well, that's fine, because after the war, I came back and went to Mount Sac, and I got a law degree, and now I teach law over at Mount San Antonio College. So, yeah, give it to me. They're like, oh. So he interprets it, and they're like, wow, that's right. I need to call the boss. The clerk is like, I don't know what to do here. I need to call my boss. So they call back to the supervisor. Hey, we got a guy here that passed the test. What do I do? So the supervisor's like, what? Here, I got another test for him. Come get it. So the clerk goes back and gets this up. Sir, we have a second test. He's like, what do you mean a second test? Sir, do you want to vote or not? Yeah, just, okay. So they give him this second test. They're like, sir, we need you to interpret this, portion of the Constitution. He's like, I already did that. Sir, this is a different test. I need you to interpret this part of the Constitution. He looks down at it. He's like, this is not in English. Yes, sir, it's in French. This is a French version of the test. Do you want to take? He's like, this is the United States. Why is this? Sir, do you want to vote? You can leave. This is ridiculous. How are you going to give me a test in French? This is the United States. This is Mississippi, not Paris. This is so ridiculous. I can't believe this. Like, well, see you later, sir. This is so great. Turns out I was stationed in Paris during World War II, so I speak French. Oui, bonbons, all that. You're like, oh, no. This guy, sir. She starts texting the manager, like, I don't know what to do. He passed it. This is crazy. He said, oui, bonbons. I don't speak French. I don't know. Voulez-vous? I don't know stuff. So they come back out. We got one more test for him. It's in Italian. He's like, you know what? After we liberated Paris, we went to North Africa. And I picked up a little Italian on the way. And this is what it means, right? They're like, this is crazy. So the manager comes out themselves, right? Man, I got to see this for myself. Like, okay, we got one more test for this guy, right? Let me go find it. It's in the files somewhere. They go through the files. Here it is. Okay. Sir, you got to pass this. You passed this. Okay, we're in business, right? Pass this test. And so he looks at the thing. He's like, we need you to tell us what this means, right? Tell us what this means. So he looks at it, and he looks at the clerk, and the manager says, it's written in the ancient language of Sanskrit. What does it mean? So the veteran looks him in the face and says, this means you don't want me to vote, and leaves. They're going to keep giving him tests until he doesn't pass. Right? It doesn't matter what he does. It doesn't matter how good a citizen he is. There are mechanisms in place, de facto mechanisms in place that can be used to take away your de jure rights. All right, this is as late as the 1950s and 60s. So you can imagine how things are going in the 1860s and 1870s, right? And how it's actually physically dangerous to go try to vote. Right? Yes, you have the right to vote, your de jure right. But let's say I'm talking about voting on a Friday night. Man, I can't wait till Saturday morning. It's going to be my first time ever. I'm so excited. I go to bed that night. The Klan is outside. Hey, we heard you're talking about voting. Oh, yeah, you hear the 15th Amendment passed? It's so exciting. It's fantastic. It's great. Like, yeah, you might not want to do that. No, I have a de jure. I registered. They're like, you might want to sit this one out. Click, click. When you come out of your house tomorrow, if you go down there and try to vote, I think you might trip and fall on that first step and land on my shotgun. Oh. Violence, intimidation, right? Other forms of keeping people from exercising de jure rights will be put in place. Poll tax. You go down to vote and they're like, okay, $1,000. $1,000, that's like a yearly salary. You want to vote or not? These are not outlawed until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act under Lyndon Johnson. These will still be used up to that point. So this is why we're still going to need a civil rights movement in the 1960s, even though these rights are technically de jure rights from the 1860s. By 1870, Tennessee has laws against intermarriage. Right, you get some of the first Jim Crow laws. Right, some of the first Jim Crow laws. Remember that term Jim Crow from the Ethnic Notions video? It was a stereotype first, but it becomes the label for the entire racial system of laws put in place. Right, the entire system of kind of separate but equal will take on the label Jim Crow. Separate hotels, barbershops. There were even separate Bibles in court to testify on. Get the black Bible. There's a story about not being able to find the right Bible because you couldn't touch a Bible that someone from another race had used, right? Now think about how ridiculous that sounds. But that's literally what it was. That's literally what it was. Why disenfranchise them? It wasn't about killing all of them, despite what you see in terms of these lynching books. It was about making them act as laborers and not as citizens. What we're going to start to see is the beginning of the end of Reconstruction. Beginning of the end of Reconstruction. By the mid-1870s, we're starting to feel like it's coming to an end. The North is tired of Reconstruction. Reconstruction's expensive. More than 90% of African Americans live in the South. So many Northerners are like, this is not our problem. Why are we paying all this money? Why do we have troops down there? Why are we concerned with this? It costs too much. Let's end it. And the beginning of the end for many is going to be 1876. There's a presidential election in 1876, often referred to as the Compromise of 1876. What happens? Well, there's a Republican candidate and a Democratic candidate. As you see, the Republican candidate is a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democratic candidate is a guy named Samuel Tilden. Both parties want the White House. The election is too close to call. Even months later, they're still recounting ballots. So what are they going to do? They compromise. The Democrats tell the Republicans, look, tell you what, we will give you the White House. Republicans are like, what? That's fantastic. That's mighty big of you. Right? Oh, you got to do one thing for us. We need you to end Reconstruction. We need you to end Reconstruction. Stop all these policies. Take the troops out of the South that have been there for a decade. The Republican Party, they think about it and they're like, cool, good deal. Rutherford B. Hayes will be elected after this kind of backroom, smoky room deal, right? And the troops will be removed from the South by 1877. Right? The troops are removed from the South by 1877. So that's why I put 1877 on the first title as the end of Reconstruction, because you can imagine if things were already going bad when there were troops there, you can imagine how crazy it gets when the troops are gone. Right? It's not a coincidence that you're going to see a spike in lynching in the 1890s, right? As we'll discuss. By 1885, most southern states had laws requiring separate schools. Between 1890 and 1900, you see the most lynchings of African Americans of any decade. And in 1896, the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson brings it all to a head. Right? Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Basically, what happens is this: Homer Plessy, a guy named Homer Plessy in New Orleans, looks a lot like Matthew McConaughey. He has blonde hair and blue eyes. Right? But Homer Plessy has one African American grandparent. So technically, according to the rules of this society, because he has at least one drop of African blood, he's black. Doesn't matter that he looks like Matthew McConaughey. Because the society says, and the race is socially constructed. It's not about biology. It's about what society says. So Homer Plessy is not white. So Homer Plessy gets on a train in 1890 in New Orleans, and he sits in the white section of the train. He's going to be arrested for sitting in the white section of the train. He's like, I'm Matthew McConaughey. What are you talking about? He's going to be arrested because they know his family, and they know he's African American by definition. This case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Homer Plessy will lose. The Supreme Court says that you can have separate facilities based on race. You can have separate but equal. Now, it's supposed to technically be equal, but it's never technically equal, right? De jure and de facto. So, for example, okay, if you have a white school, since you don't allow African Americans to attend, that means you got to have a black school too. So basically, what you get are things like this. So you have on one side of the street, the school for white children would be a nice three-story building made of brick. They got laptop computers and electricity. Across the street, they'll have a little shack with no floor, no benches, no books, no electricity. the teacher, oh yeah, that's the black school. Well, there's one of each, so it's equal. That's essentially how things are going to play out for the next, I don't know, century. So technically, separate but equal is going to be the law of the land nationally as of 1896, North and South, East and West. You're actually in violation if you do like Homer Plessy did, sit in the wrong section. And this is not just in the South, this is national. So this 1896 case is really, really important for those reasons, right? It is going to set the stage. This case is not overturned for another 60 years. It's not overturned until the Brown versus Board of Education case of 1954, which some consider kind of the catalyst for the modern civil rights movement. Right? So think about, again, this connection between past and present, between the 19th century and becoming modern, and what comes out of the challenges of this time period as well, right? The various challenges of this time period as well.